And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
Hey, Josh. Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great Wednesday, and it's the Dark Ozarks.
Yes, it is. Of course, coming off of a really awesome weekend
Yes.
with some amazing things. And tonight's episode is all about Civil War ghosts, the Civil War, especially in Missouri.
Mhm.
Recently, we were talking extensively about the Civil War in Arkansas, Civil War in Missouri, and with a particular focus on what really would be an infamous and quite tragic year in Missouri history, which was 1861.
Yes. Very, very much so. And I think when people start thinking about the Civil War, they forget that a lot of this was really a shock to people as it was unfolding,
It
and
was.
particularly on the far west here. Um, Most people, I don't think, were really anticipating a lot of concerted action early on. Although, to be perfectly honest, in the first year of the war, over half of the battles and skirmishes happened in Missouri.
They did. They really
Mhm.
did. And the war, the nation, uh, the Union and the Confederacy to interesting degrees were in essence pushing for all of these things to happen. But I think that there had to have been a bit of a mindset that they were pushing for these things to happen far to the east.
Mhm.
And I find it uniquely ironic that the first engagements take place in Missouri
Mhm.
and 1,000 miles to the west of the policymakers making all the calls, essentially all the big shots making the decisions. And it's out here, not only in the west, but at the far western edge of the west at that time, that that these events start to unfold.
Yes, and personalities emerge that really do affect the Trans Mississippi theater, and ultimately the Western theater as well, because a lot of the people, a lot of the men fighting in the early battles here, ultimately fought in the Western theater too, which of course was actually east of here.
Yes, and yes. So for people that might be confused, you have the Eastern Theater, then you have the Western Theater, and then you have the theater that is west of the Western Theater, which would be ours, uh,
Yes.
known as the Trans Mississippi. And of course, as this history starts to unfold, as we start to dig into it, a number of interesting hauntings start to make more sense.
They do. And that's one thing that is always interesting. I find that when people report activity or they see an apparition or something, um, a lot of times they're seeing something that they're seeing it completely out of context because they have no idea why something is going on in a
Mm,
particular place. Um, and then when you combine it with the war and if they see soldiers and so forth, particularly out here, we get a lot of, well, that doesn't make sense because nothing happened here. And
yes.
a lot of people really not aware of how much Civil War activity happened in their backyard here.
In many cases, literally in someone's backyard then, and of course the location being someone's backyard today.
Yes.
In honor of our uh, Civil War history, I just want to make note. I do have my McDonald County Historical Society cup.
There you
I do
go.
have it full of black coffee, and I, um, I realized something. Of course, I've been running all day, and I've not had time to prepare much food,
Hmm.
and I have very and with my training outside of Dark Ozarks, with my training, I have very specific requirements in terms of the food that I prep and that sort of thing. And as I was digging through the cupboards, literally 5 minutes ago, I realized something, which is I do not have snack food. I have like 6 almonds left in the bag. And so it was possibly particularly apropos that I just decided to open a can of beans. um, that Beans and black coffee, definitely a substrate of the Ozarks in the 19th century, and certainly well into the 20th.
Well, and certainly during the war, all you need is a little hardtack and you'd be set. So
No, I should make that.
why is the question? If anyone has ever had hardtack, why they don't really want it again.
Mm.
Hardtack does make MREs look very appetizing. So
It's very clear. Also, our sponsor.
yes. There we go. Yes, we want to thank our sponsor, always buying books, Joplin, Missouri, for sponsoring the show and events. Including a conference coming up in October, October Country, that will be held at VFW 534 in Joplin, Missouri. It'll be an all-day event with all kinds of things going on, covering a variety of subjects, dark history, mysteries, legends, unexplained phenomena. And you can go to the page to the events and find it, buy your tickets. And it's going to be a great time. But Always Buying Books is a great resource. Go check them out, either in person or online. They have a website, alwaysbuyingbooks.com, as well as on Facebook. And a lot of their inventory gets listed there as well. And tell them that Dark Ozarks sent you.
Also, of course, a great stop on a Route 66 tour.
Yes. Yeah, right on Route 66.
The location is haunted, and we will be shooting either we'll be shooting something there soon.
Yes. Not very long we'll be there, and y'all get to see that. So
that's right. Also, invitation to the June 11th event at the George Ball House in Webb City.
Yes. Also, the event's on the page, so you can go check it out and buy tickets. It is limited space. It is a beautiful Victorian home that is very haunted. And we will be covering some of the very interesting local history, the home, and have a paranormal investigation. So it'll be a great night.
It really will. And definitely, certainly when we stepped in just briefly for other reasons on Saturday, definitely some interesting things.
Yes, things were happening then. So, it can prove to be a very interesting night there.
It really can. So make plans for that. Now, we've talked about this a bit, but there are numerous experiences of individuals seeing Civil War soldiers.
Yes.
In the Ozarks, and experiences can range from something that appears to be an echo to something that seems very sentient and interactive. One story that I think I'll kick off on, because I haven't talked about it for a while and haven't talked about it tonight, is young man, farmhouse on the south side of Springfield, rural south of Springfield. And this was during the 80s. And there was realized that there was a mounting level of poltergeist activity in the house, and it was corresponding with him having put up a Leonard Skinner material that had the Confederate battle flag on it.
Oh,
and then later seeing an apparition of a Union soldier.
and it definitely could be a trigger object. And that's something that, we do on investigations, often are utilize objects that would be familiar to people of the time period, of whatever time period that is relevant at a place. And often it does spur up activity. I just think I was telling you last night that at Kendrick House, when there have been times that reenactors will have cannons there and they'll shoot the cannons, and it gets extremely active when
Yes.
that they do that. It's and I just think it's like, oh wow, just like you hear something, you hear a song or a particular snippet of conversation, it takes you back years to something else, and I think it works the same way.
I tend to agree, and it brings up an interesting thing. Now let's talk about the reenactment on Saturday a little bit.
Okay.
It was absolutely amazing. I was
Yeah.
so excited to be there. Special shout out to Dark Ozark, friend of Dark Ozarks, Jim Ridenauer of the Ritchie Mansion, caretaker and historian of the Ritchie Mansion, who was participating in the reenactment battle.
Yes, Jim did a great. He did a great job on the field and actually coordinating a lot of the efforts. And I also want to shout out to Battle of Carthage Inc., who put the event on. Kelly Mike Harris did a great job, as well as the Civil War Ranch where it was hosted. The ranch there is fantastic and beautiful.
It
And if
really
you're going to book events, you might check them out. So
I would recommend doing that. It's a beautiful barn and
yeah,
beautiful
really good.
beautiful lawn. One of very special moments for me and I think for all of us was the Civil War dance at the end
Mm-hmm. It
of
really
the
was.
day, and just getting to see that, and then part of the dance took place in the old barn, and then for the larger dances, because it just stopped raining, they moved out into a large circle on the lawn. It was just an incredible experience, and then the battle itself. So, from my basic understanding is that this is a scaled version or demonstrating the types of movements and um, points of conflict that took place during the Battle of Carthage on July 5th, 1861.
Yes, obviously in much sort of miniature scale, because the battle itself went over about 8 miles terrain before they got to Carthage, and then went through Carthage. And so, and at times was spread out up to a mile across. So, but they did demonstrate some of the types of maneuvers that happened, and including when the Union formed a square around the wagon, and what they were demonstrating was there was a very large wagon supply train following the federal column, and they were being flanked, and to protect the supply train before it got back to town, where we're between the rivers and Carthage. Colonel Siegel actually put the wagons, there were 32 of them, into columns of 4 into a square, and then they made a hollow square of men around it to protect the wagons, which is a very European style maneuver that actually was used at Waterloo, in fact, by the British, and then and continued to be used throughout the 19th century in Europe. But as far as they know, it's the only time it was used during the American Civil War.
That's incredible, and and that really begins to speak into the personalities and the backgrounds of the individuals who were involved in the war.
Yes, that's true. I mean, and ironically, to be, for one thing, I guess we haven't mentioned yet that the Battle of Carthage was actually the first large scale land battle of the war, 17
Yes.
days before Bull Run. And and there were uh, almost 8,000 men total fighting. And so where you would expect this out, towards Washington or Richmond or somewhere, it's happening on the edge, the far western edge of the United States at that point. And that's a concept that most people don't think about, that this, you had this very large scale battle going on. And it's amazing when you think about that the number of personalities that happened to be in this spot at the same time, and the things that they went on to do later. We've joked before about, history in the 19th century that we talk about is six people and smoke and mirrors, and I think all six of them were there, it seems like, just about.
They were. And really, really quickly, so something that I'm largely, there's seeing as two factors at hand. There were a number of casualties at the Battle of Carthage, but comparatively, certainly compared to the number of soldiers who were there, and compared to battles in a little bit later in the war, the casualties are startlingly light.
That's true, and in part, I think it has to do with the firearms, because the Union soldiers, they were still using a little older firearms. There were improvements made through the war that, as the war went on, rifles became much more deadly. And then on the Confederate side, virtually all of them were using their personal firearms and hunting rifles.
Yes. And you mentioned it at a particular creek is where most of the casualties actually occurred.
Right, Dry Fork, yeah.
Now, where is that in relationship to, say, like the Kendrick House or Civil War?
Further north. It's probably 3 miles further north, and the crossing that they were at was just slightly to the west of where the Kendrick House is, not far west, but just slightly. But that's where the bottleneck started happening while they were trying to get back to town and make sure that the wagons were secure. But it's also where the Confederates took most of their casualties.
Right. So for people who are trying to get a global grasp of this, the governor of Missouri is leading a Missouri State Guard or Missouri Partisan
militia.
Army, militia of about 6,000 men.
Yes, and at least about a third of them are unarmed, and actually a majority of even the cavalry was unarmed.
And some incredibly interesting personalities within that group. But there has been, first of all, beginning with diplomatic confrontation, and then not so diplomatic confrontation.
Yes.
at St. Louis, then Jefferson City, and the representative, essentially the Missouri government at Jefferson City is fleeing.
Yes, they and the militia, and I guess to preface, they had already stormed the U.S. government's armory at Liberty, near what is now Kansas City, and taken the weapons. including cannon, including one old Sacramento that is from the Mexican War, and the lore is that it's made from steel from the bells of churches in Mexico. But anyway, and so then the next plan was that the governor planned on storming the armory in St. Louis, which was much bigger and actually had enough munitions and arms that basically control of the Trans-Mississippi and part of the Western Theater depended on that. And so he had formed a camp right outside of St. Louis, which he named after himself, Camp Jackson, and then named the streets in the camp after prominent Confederate figures back east. All while he's still publicly maintaining a moderate position of trying to remain neutral or at least stay in the Union, but not fight. But of course, his actions certainly were speaking louder than his words. So the commander of the federal forces in St. Louis, the overall commander was General Fremont, who's more renowned as an explorer, but he was not on site. He was, I think he had gone to Washington at that point. And so General Nathaniel Lyon was in charge. And so he basically went undercover with an attaché, took a wagon into Camp Jackson, and they were both dressed as women, so they would not attract attention, and spied on what was going on, and were able to confirm that they were training a large militia, and that their plan was to storm the armory. So he returned to headquarters and then sent the governor a message asking for a meeting. And so Governor Jackson and a few of his top aides went to St. Louis to meet with him. And basically Lyon confronted him that he knew what he was doing. And of course he denies it. They get into a heated exchange, and Jackson ends up saying that he's not going to submit to the requests of the federal government to supply troops. Lyon tells him that he would rather see he and everyone in the room, including himself, 6 feet under the sod rather than to concede authority to the state from the federal government. And Jackson basically responds in kind. And so then Lyon tells him he'll give him 30 minutes safe passage through his lines, and dinner is served.
And then upon return to Jefferson City, Jackson has the bridges blown up behind him.
Yes, as they're going back, they blow up all the bridges between St. Louis and Jefferson City, and then proceed to head south with the idea of meeting up with General McCulloch in Arkansas with regular Confederate troops. And so then Lyon sends Colonel Sigel, another interesting personality involved, with large contingent of men south to intercept. And then Lyon is assembling more men in St. Louis and following. And the plan was to catch Jackson in a pincher move and shut him down.
Yes.
And,
if that had been successful, I'm assuming Lyon's primary endeavor was to arrest Jackson.
well, I mean, basically it was to stop them from meeting up with the Confederates. It's a little hard to get, I imagine that there would have been house arrest. I mean, I'm conjecturing as an attorney there. It's, records don't really go into that too much detail. think the most pressing matter was stop this from happening, because, they didn't want a larger force from Arkansas and Texas marching into Missouri. But if they had been successful, it definitely would have gone a long way to securing Missouri, for the Union, and probably eliminating a good deal of the guerrilla fighting.
Right. and this is really setting the stage for the fact that Missouri remains a divided state
Yes.
through the war. And I find it particularly interesting, not because I'm patriotically inclined toward my adopted state, although I am, but having grown up reading a considerable amount of Civil War history, these events, which have been so pivotal and to so many things that are happening elsewhere in the nation at the time, but then in a sort of a cascade response, that they are pivotal and implicated in so many other things that happened throughout the war, that more has not been, I would say, nationally written. Certainly it's been regionally written, but it's not been nationally written at the same level as other things that have happened in other theaters.
That's true. And to be real fair, even regionally, it's not covered as well as much as you would think. I mean, there are some very good resources, but it's not really, it really has not been covered that well. And to be perfectly honest, there's a lot of people who grew up in this area that have no idea what happened here. I often will lead into presentations, with that fact, asking if they know where the first land battle of the war was and everything. And even when they're standing in Carthage, and a lot of people who grew up in Carthage don't know, don't realize that even if they know the battle, they don't realize it was the first battle. It's just not talked about much.
No. and I think it's also easy, the surprisingly light casualty count. Of course, I feel like I should always put that in quotes, or somehow with an asterisk and a footnote, because certainly for the individuals who died in that battle, in the first pitched land battle of the Civil War, their death was not insignificant.
No, and at that point, it was fairly, significant. We're viewing that significance in hindsight versus, battles that ended up with 50,000 casualties,
Yes.
later on in the Eastern Theater. So
Which
just,
is
I mean,
hard to conceptualize that.
it really is. And, the sheer numbers of casualties in the war. I mean, 600,000 casualties, really did affect America's relationship with death, with
Yes.
spiritualism, etc. And really led to much more of a preoccupation with the idea of ghosts and hauntings and so forth, as a connection to so many that were lost, and for so many not having a closure because they, may have died 1,000 miles away, or at least 100 miles away. And in the 1860s, that meant you did not have closure. You did not have that funeral. Many never, might not have ever seen the graves where their family members died, were buried.
Yeah.
For a modern, for listeners, the image that comes to my mind is actually from the movie Unforgiven, when the end, the mother comes out west to see her daughter's grave, and by that point, the rest of the family have moved on, and she's standing there, just looking at this grave. But that's really what happened for a lot of America. And so it did alter the concept, how we dealt with death and viewed it, and actually made us a lot more open to spiritualism and hauntings and so forth, that we remained open-minded to up until the 70s. And then we got ourselves scared, but that's another issue.
Well, and I think that is, I think that whole concept bears, digging into a little bit. We obviously we're, coming out of the 1860s, we're moving into, a Victorian era that is characterized by, from our perspective, it looks like a gothic obsession with death.
Mhm.
And that not being unique to the United States. However, for example, England, to my knowledge, would not, it would be another generation with World War One before you would experience a mass casualty event all at once, in that sense of
Yeah. Although they did have wars during the 19th century. It was World War One that you had so many casualties, but the concept of mourning too really was fixed in the English Victorian mind from Queen Victoria, because she remained in mourning after Prince Albert died for 40 years to the end of her life.
Right. Now, this is an area that I don't think we've really dug into. I'm just curious as to your thoughts, because in America, the United States was thought of as kind of a new world, trying all of these new things. Certainly, and not exclusively, but certainly heavily influenced by the Enlightenment and the rationality, the scientific processes, and that we're really at odds with a much older folkloric traditions of essentially the poorer classes of Europe.
Very true. Very true. Well, at least the founding fathers and a lot of the early thinkers and intellectuals in the New World certainly were influenced by the Enlightenment and Voltaire, etc., to good ends. But at the same time, you had and a lot of the immigrants during the 1600s and 1700s were more well-to-do. They were the more educated class, etc. So they were exposed to these ideas. Then you started in the later 1700s having more immigration from the lower classes, the working classes in Europe, those being displaced. Of course, in the 1840s, you have the Irish famine. And so as time goes on, you have a blending of those influences, I think. And certainly by the 1860s.
And I find that I haven't really dug into this from a sociological perspective. I just find the potentiality very interesting, because certainly there had to have been up until the Civil War. So this is my, I won't go so far as to say it's an argument. This is my idea. That certainly the upper class, or the academic and intellectual class of America from, say, 1800 to the 1850s was, could be potentially argued was really on a trajectory of Enlightenment ideals.
Yes,
and
I think that's fair to say.
And that these Enlightenment ideals would have been in contrast with more of the folkloric ideas of the quote unquote peasantry, of the lower class, a good chunk of which I came from. So
Yeah.
that
And honestly, I came from both, I have ancestry that fit in both categories. Yeah.
and now in the Ozarks, obviously in the rural Ozarks, we were going to be dealing with a lot more of the folks who were more associative with the folkloric
Hmm.
um, aspects rather than the Enlightenment aspects. But on the what is interesting to me as a possibility is that the mass casualty deaths of the Civil War impacted all the strata.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, you might, for example, and this is kind of where I'm going with this. I suppose it might be an argument now. I don't know if it's very solid, but the idea and is that certainly for the the more intellectual academic classes that might have before the Civil War might have scorned the idea of communication with the dead,
Hmm.
or superstitions like death omens and these sorts of things, that after the trauma of the 1860s, that certainly there can be that idea that maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I need closure. I need to talk to a family member. I need something more, something that is more tactile than pure Enlightenment ideals.
Yes. I think so. And I think that's just that human experience that, no matter what we think intellectually, when you're dealing with trauma and intense stress and displacement, that that rational mind kind of sets itself aside, for the emotional needs. And it's as we sometimes say, in my head I know this, but you feel something else. And I think that was going on. And I think a good example of that would be Mary Todd Lincoln. I mean, certainly came from, um, the upper echelon of society, came from wealth, very educated, uh, went through immeasurable loss, multiple children, then the trauma of her husband dying. And, she wholeheartedly embraced spiritualism.
Yes.
And um, at that moment, I'm not sure that anyone could really blame anyone for doing that.
No, and I would largely conjecture. Now, my understanding is that the 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 move now, so Civil War ghost spiritualism, it ties together. That obviously the working parts of spiritualism are not new.
No, no, and really in the United States, it began to uh, come to I guess a more formalized essence or idea would be in the 1830s with the Thought Sisters and Lily Dale and so forth.
Yes.
Lily Dale was a retreat in New York for spiritualists. Um, and so, but at that point it certainly was more fringe. It was more of a oddity, an attraction. The Fox sisters would travel and people would pay to go to a seance, that kind of thing. um, and then I think with the realities of the war, it just made it more appealing.
Yes. So it's in a sense setting the stage and then becoming its own phenomena after
Yes, yes.
afterwards. And
And giving comfort, and of course, unfortunately, also it gave rise to scam artists as well within the movement.
right. And about what point do you feel like the spiritualist movement began to wane?
Really, it did not really wane until the started to in the 20s. Because well, it kind of waned a little bit around the the turn of the century, and then with World War I, it gained momentum again. And again, tied to all the loss. And became even bigger in Europe than it had been ever before. Of course, there were more casualties in Europe. And then you started having some prominent people becoming advocates, Arthur Conan Doyle being one. And that literally was out of he and his wife believing that they could communicate with their son who'd been killed in the war, in World War I. And then you start having people like Harry Houdini actually unmasking frauds.
Yes.
And that process started to make more people hesitant, you know, as frauds were revealed. You know, Houdini went as far as to say that he thought every spiritualist was a fraud, but who knows? And so then it started waning through the 20s. Then the Depression, it really didn't, even though people were struggling, they didn't really turn to that. And then with the advent of World War II, it seemed like modernity took over.
Right. There was a heavy shift into that industrialization, into modernity, and
Yeah.
quite frankly, I think a really strong, even though it didn't have the name on it, but certainly a very strong cultural push into post-Enlightenment secularism, where religion or spirituality being, I think, temporarily replaced with merchandising,
or at least hope that technology would solve sociological problems.
yes,
Which,
and
and again, I think it's a little of a column A and a little column B, is the answer. Either one necessarily works on its own in isolation to solve everything.
I agree, and it's something with and we'll get back to the ghosts in the Civil War here in a moment, but something that I find interesting, that when we talk about spiritualism, and certainly I think Houdini had a big push on this from a pop cultural standpoint, we almost exclusively associate spiritualism with charlatanism, or with charlatanism. In terms of consciousness.
Yeah.
I would argue that's not reality.
Well, no, and of course, spiritualism in its different facets was broader than seances, etc. Broader than just people like the Fox sisters and so forth. But the sort of the philosophical aspect of spiritualism kind of waned. You have different movements that were encompassed there, like Theosophy, etc. And it kind of waned. And then, of course, in the 60s, then the New Age movement started, which basically has picked and chosen cherry-picked certain things out of those traditions.
Yes.
And modified them, as to convenience, in my opinion. But
and I think that that for example, going back to that post-Civil War spiritualism movement in the beginning in the Finger Lakes region of New York in the 1830s, that there are crossovers with a lot of very traditional folklore, and certainly a shamanistic aspect to the idea that I think speaks very powerfully and very honestly into society, while I'm also not denying the existence of scam artists.
Right. No, and I agree, if you can actually if you really look at it, you can draw those parallels to uh, Lily Dale and the beginnings of the spiritualist movement is not being that much different than the the activity that was condemned at the Salem witch trials.
Very,
Uh,
very true. Actually, pretty doggone similar.
yeah, but it's how was it, what was it viewed in that context? And it goes back to what you said. The difference was, really the Enlightenment movement uh, taking hold of um, intellectual America
Hmm.
by that point, between the late 1600s and 1800.
Yes. Now, fast forwarding to 1861 Missouri,
Mm-hmm.
and we have certainly a sparsely populated state compared to what it is today,
Yes.
but not an empty state. There was, a sizable, um, just out of mm, settlement, or just out of the pioneer
Yeah.
settlement generation, that there were,
Uh-huh.
you know realistic infrastructure that had been developed, and certainly a state identity had very much been developed since between the 1830s and the 1860s.
That's definitely true. And now you did not have infrastructure statewide. I think at that point the railroad was only 30, 40 miles west of St. Louis at
Hmm.
Tipton. You did have overland stage. You did have some stage routes. The late 1850s, a wire road went up um, connecting Springfield to St. Louis down to Fort Smith.
Yeah.
Um, but uh, there were very few bridges in Missouri at the time for horses or wagons, and then just whatever railroad bridges. But um, so it was still kind of rough getting around, but there was some infrastructure.
Right. And of course, as you get in further into the Ozarks interior, the infrastructure gets less and less.
Yes, like with the Battle of Carthage, they actually crossed, let's see, one, two, three rivers and a slough, and there were no bridges. Actually, there were no bridges in the county at that point.
Wow.
But
And
to give an idea on population for the county at the beginning of the war, there were over 6,000 people in the county,
in
um, in
Jasper
Jasper
County.
County. At the end of the war, there were about 30 people left.
Yes, which is incredible to even begin to wrap one's head around, that the kind of essentially devastation upon the civilian population. Although we're not saying that the civilian population was being specifically targeted at this point. uh, they were paying a heck of a price for this.
They were. I mean, now and yeah, there were civilians that were killed throughout the war, but a lot of it was just depopulation of people leaving because things got so bad, and um, scorched earth policy, etc. So used by both sides. So
Yeah.
there were a lot of stories of women, uh, their houses are burnt and they've got their kids in the woods, and they're shooting squirrels and eating berries through the winter. And so those that could generally, if they were northern leaning, they went north or west to Kansas. And if they were southern leaning, they went to Texas generally.
Yes. And that yeah, and I can especially, you know, have essentially losing everything trying to subsist through a Missouri winter. Texas would start looking really good really fast.
Yeah, if you had a means to get there, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of rivers and bridges, one of the reasons that it is most likely that the outcome of the Battle of Carthage was a Confederate victory was because of the Osage River.
That's true. That's true. Because the pincher move that the Federals wanted to execute was thwarted because General Lyon, who was bringing reinforcements, between Sigel bringing his men down and Lyon bringing the reinforcements, there had been a lot of rain, and the Osage River was flooded and they couldn't cross.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were delayed a couple of days.
Now, my disclaimer on what I'm about to say is based on the fact that once you're within a pitched battle, you do what you got to do.
Right.
Now, I did find it particularly of irony that on Independence Day, July 4th, Colonel Sigel is on the Carthage Square, assuring the residents that he is there to protect them.
Mm-hmm.
And 24 hours later, his artillery is lobbing shells into the downtown square.
Yes. Of course, I think if the battle had gone the way he had planned, it would, it would not have ended up back in town. But that just, a combination of those factors, that if he'd been able to finish the battle on the prairie, particularly if he'd had his reinforcements, then the town probably would not have had any damage whatsoever. But on the other hand, people sometimes will say, well, he ran, or he just, this or that. Well, you have to protect your assets. You have to protect your men, and not, as I say, throw the baby out with the bathwater. So losing 32 wagons of supplies and being outnumbered 3-1, with your reinforcements not showing up, sometimes it's better to fall back and fight another day, which ultimately is what happened.
Yes, and I find this of particular interest on a cursory overview of battles without looking at the larger strategy. It's very easy to say, kind of look at it like sports and go, okay, who won?
Right.
And of course, even now, as we discuss these issues, as we discuss the sort of the end tallies for the Confederates, the end tallies for the Union, the personalities involved, it's still easy to run across people who, I feel like we have a large majority of people who are almost unaware that there even was a war here, and then we have a small number of people who are extremely aware, and often draw their own dividing lines about their side or their viewpoints in relationship to it. So that, I realize we're treading in interesting waters as soon as you start bringing up, men like Shelby, Nathaniel Lyon, Sigel, and it is always the thing I would encourage people to consider is the same thing that we always come back to with Dark Ozarks. Sometimes there are no easy answers. These are highly complex situations, but they're also highly complex men who were acting under a wide variety of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And as with all men, human beings don't always act rationally.
Mm-hmm.
They don't always say exactly what they mean. Sometimes they say what they do mean, but very vehemently under duress. There's lots and lots of factors, and so I just urge people to um, tread respectfully. Of course, we are going to do our best to tread respectfully over all these men's memories, and um, not throw too many people under the bus, hopefully including ourselves. And there's one of my favorite, and I think really coming back to the fact that in so many cases there's now the caveat to this is that there are some pretty reasonable heroes, and there are occasionally some pretty reasonable villains within the
Mm-hmm.
milieu.
Oh
But
yeah.
many of these individuals, I say the majority of the individuals, were oftentimes just doing the best that they knew how to do.
Right. They, as most people do in any time, they're doing the best they can with, the skill set they have, with the information they have. And also you have to look at this in context of the time. It's looking at these events from today's perspective is to inform us, of our own set of ethics or mores, but it's not. You can't judge history by what would happen today or what would be accepted today, but by trying to objectively look at history and the various people involved and their rationales and their motivations, you can hopefully learn something to do better for yourself now. And
Yeah,
that's the thing. We we can't fight the battles today that happened 160 years ago and expect to get anywhere.
right. And so in that in that vein, one of the dynamics that I find really fascinating is not only Siegel, who was a German immigrant, one of the
Mhm.
48ers involved in the German Revolution, or the Prussian War, and ultimately ends up immigrating to St. Louis, which has a by now massive German population,
Mhm.
and then is integral in securing German recruitment into the Union Army.
Yes. Well, and he had been superintendent of St. Louis schools and been very successful at that as well. And he was very successful overall in the Prussian War too. So he was very competent.
Yes, and really, and we begin to see this with the Battle of Carthage, that he seems, again, like you said, he's vastly outnumbered. So for people who are trying to grasp sort of the larger context, the Missouri State Guard, Missouri Militia, 6,000 men, 2,000 of which are unarmed,
Mhm.
are
But he doesn't know that.
no, are are marching south and presumably on the main road to Carthage with
Mhm.
the intent of getting into Arkansas.
Yes. And his mission is to keep that from happening, and to keep because there was a much larger force in Arkansas, and so they didn't want the Missourians to link up with the Confederates, the regular Confederates down there, because it would be a massive army that would outnumber any Union recruitment that at that point in time.
At that point.
Yeah, I mean,
And
ultimately, more Union soldiers were recruited in Missouri than Confederate, but it's so early in the war. I mean, you're really barely 2 months into the war, really, you know.
Yes. And in a war that up until this point had been largely, not exclusively, but largely diplomatic conflict.
Yeah, I mean, there've been a few very, very minor skirmishes, but nothing near the scale of what happened.
No. And so you have this situation. I just find it particularly ironic. It's silly, I know, because it's really relevant, but the Southern Army is approaching from the north, and the Northern Army is shored up in the south for
Yeah,
the Battle of Carthage.
yeah.
And the Union Army, under Colonel Sigel, marches out to engage the
Mhm.
Confederates, quote unquote. How comfortable are you with calling this approaching army the Confederate Army? Because technically they're not quite there.
Well, I mean, I guess you just say more of, a state guard. I mean, you really did not have but a handful of experienced officers. You had some men that had some training at Camp Jackson, but certainly were not trained soldiers. And they were not, certainly not disciplined. They'd never encountered battle. And most of them were farmers, to be perfectly honest.
Yes.
Mhm.
It's and Siegel's men, although just by running numbers were vastly outnumbered, they were much better trained.
Better trained, more disciplined, and better equipped.
Yes. And so we do have this situation where the Jackson's forces moving southward against the Union Army of 1100, approximately 1100. First of all, it is massive. It's a mile long.
Mhm.
Jackson, I think it's very interesting. Jackson seems to use his unarmed men to great effect.
Yeah, I mean, and there's debate on whether he or uh, someone else actually decided to do that, but they did. They had a lot of the unarmed men mounted, and as well as some infantry, and flanked them on the east with large numbers, so that it looked like it was a major maneuver, which, with the lay of the land, put the supply train in being exposed. So Siegel had to deal with that. And to be perfectly honest, if you look at the numbers and so forth, the fact that Siegel wasn't, beaten badly or lose a lot of men or equipment, I think is the most telling thing, because it certainly could have happened,
Yeah.
particularly if reinforcements didn't show up. And
Right.
so I think, sometimes you hear people say, well, they just, the Federals just lost badly or whatever. And it's like, well, no, I mean, he could have fought it out and he might have won, but lost a lot too. But by the same token, you could argue that even not being as well prepared, the Confederates should have done better. They led
Right.
a much smaller army tactically retreat, ultimately, to regroup,
Mhm.
when it could be argued they should have hit more of a hammer blow.
And missed the opportunity to take a 32 wagon supply train,
Exactly.
which would have come in very handy
Yeah.
in short order. So, and probably would have come in very handy and might have even more dramatically affected the Battle of Wilson's Creek.
That's very true, which I'm sure was one thing that was on Siegel's mind, is that, the value of that wagon train, um, on down the road. So
Yes. So jumping in, so jumping there's a number of characters I want to talk about, but jumping away from the characters for a moment, there's a lot of paranormal occurrences that have been experienced, in some cases very directly,
mhm,
in the Carthage area.
mhm.
What are some of your standout moments that you really associate with or from the Battle of Carthage?
Well, there are several places along Civil War Road that people have for a long time have given accounts of seeing apparitions of soldiers, um, and which made sense because the line was scattered so far out, and um, and obviously at the Kendrick House, which was commandeered by the Federals as a field hospital for a time, and then after they vacated, then the Confederates used it. Um, and there definitely is a Civil War presence there. People for decades have talked about seeing Civil War soldiers on the yard, as well as in the home. There's activity that particularly connected with the dining table that actually was an operating table during the battle. That images of soldiers or disembodied voices, etc., that seem to be connected to the war, definitely are
Yes.
there. Um, uh, Downtown on the square, there have been accounts over time of apparitions on the courthouse yard, including soldiers, which would make sense of the fighting then, as well as there were a number of skirmishes throughout the war there. And the square burned 2 times, down completely. And then what is now City Park, which is about 2 blocks away, was actually a cemetery at the time of the battle. And that is where artillery later in the day was set up and was actually shooting shells onto the square where the Confederates were. And they later moved the cemetery to a new location, and they had relocated a lot of the bodies that of those that were killed in the battle to the National Cemetery in Springfield when it opened. But around the turn of the century, they expanded the park, and they were putting in fountains and so forth. And during some of the excavations, they found that they missed some of the bodies. And
Oops.
so, yeah, and even to this day, it is possible that there could be some graves that were missed. They don't really know unless they really excavate the whole thing. But at various times, people have said they've seen at first what they think are people in reenactment clothes or period clothing in the park, and then figure out that it's not a living person. So you have activity there. There are places around the square that at times there's phantom cannon fire or musket fire. The Opera House is one.
Yes.
And I always liked that because it was documented in the newspaper when the building was being built in 1877, that the construction workers would complain about the sounds of cannon fire
While they were building,
while they were building it. Yeah.
which is to me just phenomenal. But of course,
And
these
I have heard musket fire in the building itself, not
and
cannon
that's
fire.
and just for clarification, that was that physically hearing it or hearing it on the EVP recordings?
I physically have heard it before.
Yeah, yeah. What do you make of that sort of phenomena?
I
How
think
do you think that?
I think most of the time it is residual, just an echo, kind of imprinted in the environment. Those kind of things are, and there are several people that I know of that have heard the cannon fire, um, and one that actually called me as it was happening, um, and they all describe it as, to the point of, they think that either there's a gas line explosion or a truck has run into the building, something major, because it's so real. And then they investigate and everything's perfectly fine.
Yes. I find that just incredible. And now the Union encampment was
Mhm.
really just a handful of blocks east of the square.
Yeah, east and just a little south, off River Road. And it's now the State Battlefield Park, but there's a spring there. At the time, it was James Spring. And on the cliff above, the Jameses had their home. Later, it was destroyed at some point during the war, and then after the war, Dr. Carter built a house on the foundations, and then it was known as Carter Spring. It took on his name, but it was also the site of a Underground Railroad stop.
Was it?
Ironically, yeah.
Was that
James,
the
yeah, the James.
house or the spring itself?
Well, there are a couple versions. One that they would secret them in the house, but that there's a cave that's next to the spring. That the cave has been filled in, so people don't get in there and get hurt. The city filled it in, but that there was a cave in there that that slaves would hide in as well.
Wow. That, of course, that as an underground stop in that location in the southwest corner of Missouri, escaping slaves would have had a heck of a journey still in front of them.
Yes. Well, by the time the war was coming around, most of them, they would try to go to Kansas.
Mm,
And then some would still ultimately try to end up going north, either to the East Coast or to Canada. But most of them in this part of the state would end up going to Kansas, and then sometimes on north.
that makes sense. Now, you've had some really unique experiences as well at James Spring.
Yes, I have, including with the Civil War soldier there. Um, we were investigating one evening, and it was probably between midnight and 1 a.m. We were finishing up, getting ready to leave, and the park, the encampment, and the encampment area itself, it's kind of a funnel shape, and going back to a point, narrows. And so we were kind of at the back of the park and starting to walk out, and I just happened to be the last one in line. And all of a sudden I start to take a step. I can't take it. It's like I'm rooted to the ground, and the sensation of something heavy just falling over you like a heavy wet blanket. It's the only thing I can describe. It's not exactly right, but that's the closest. And it's funny, I've heard investigators across the country use the wet blanket thing, when it happens, it, but you can, you see everything, you're just rooted, and try to call out, no noise comes out, everyone keeps walking. And so I'm struggling to try to move, and you're just fixed to this spot. And it had gone on long enough that, they probably walked, 1,000, 1,500 feet at least, maybe a little bit more. Enough that I was like, okay, this isn't funny. So, try to push, one last huge push, and I start, suddenly, boom, resistance is gone, and I catch myself from falling. And I turn around, and behind me is a shadow man. standing maybe 4 feet behind me, and he's got the outline of a soldier, and you can see the bill of the cap, and looks like he's got a long barrel rifle in his left hand, resting on his shoulder. And it's just like he's facing me, and then he turns to his left, takes 3 steps, and disappears.
Wow. That's that had to have been an intense experience.
It was. Yeah, that is the one time. That is the only time in investigating that I ever, kind of got to the point of, okay, this isn't funny.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we were there. We were there during the day, about 2 years ago.
Mhm.
I didn't have an incident
Yeah.
occur, but the place feels different.
Yes, and you definitely feel like you're watched. And I know other people who've had similar experiences there. Some seeing a soldier, some seeing, what looks like a partisan ranger or a bushwhacker, including our producer Alex. Um, and so I know a number of people have had similar experiences there. Another thing that tends to happen there is that when you investigate, you don't get a lot of results um, when men are there.
Mm,
And I think partly because it was an encampment, and um, they were on picket all the time. They were wary, and so our conclusion is they don't know whether a man's friend or foe. So generally, what we do, we'd separate into groups. Women would investigate. The guys would do something. The guys won't get anything, and then women would.
wow. Yeah.
And lots of EVPs. One of the one of the things that happened there that's impressed me the most was there were I think there were 3 or 4 of us women sitting in a circle, and you could hear someone walking around us, and you could hear the swish of the trousers.
Mm,
And then we got EVPs that indicated that they were there to protect us.
wow. Now this brings up an interesting question. It appears during the 1860s that in many cases, and I'm referring to one of our um, favorite daughters of Carthage,
Yeah.
that women and girls could cross battle lines, interact with troops on both sides, largely without suspect. Is that the case?
Yes, actually, it's the case, and actually, throughout all the theaters in the Civil War, a lot of the spies and couriers were women, and because they weren't suspected. And in this particular case, Myra Shirley, um, she was a teenage girl, 14 when the war broke out, and she was very well educated, basically a debutante, spoke several languages, played various musical instruments, etc. And I think for quite a long time, no one really suspected that she would be a spy. You know, maybe that she wasn't that kind of girl, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, and she would actually go into saloons and sit down and play the piano and listen to the soldiers and get intel, and then take it from the Union soldiers and then take it to the Confederates.
And the Battle of Carthage really appears to have been an inciting incident for her personally.
Well, yeah, and her family overall, because and they were Southern leaning. They were her father was had slaves, had large tract of land in the county, and then owned a hotel and tavern on the north side of the square. And when the fighting got into town and there was fighting on the square, um, Myra actually nursed a wounded on the square. And the events of the battle propelled her brother Bud, John Allison, Shirley, to join a partisan ranger group and fight. He was a couple years older than her, and then he ended up getting killed, and that really kind of cemented it. I guess they were very close, and she had worked as a courier before that, but after that, she, just, really went gun ho into the cause.
Yes. And Myra Shirley, Myra Bell Shirley, is later remembered in the dime novels
Yeah.
of the day as the infamous outlaw Belle Starr.
Yes.
And she has a direct connection, which we've gotten to speak about regularly at the location, but a direct connection with the Ritchie mansion.
Yes, yes. The Ritchie Mansion in Newtonia, which Mr. Ritchie was a staunch unionist. His son had a union brigade in the war. She was taken to the Ritchie Mansion and interrogated. Um, some records would indicate on two separate occasions, but at least once, and that she escaped. And um, the romantic version is that she jumped out to the second story bedroom window onto the back of a horse. And um, while some say, "Oh, that's very fanciful and unrealistic," her father was renowned as being the best horseman in Southwest Missouri, and so if she had some of her father's skill, it's entirely possible, and she certainly put those skills to use later on.
It and it might just be the hopeless historic romantic in me, but I really personally adhere to that particular narrative.
Well, everything that we can see, if you look at her life and everything that she did from the time that she was 14, she certainly was not a shrinking violet, even though she was very refined at that point. So I certainly, I can envision her being bold enough to do that. Um, it's just a matter, did she have the skill to actually land the jump? And
Yeah.
it's possible. So.
It is, I think, and I love that. I've never brought this up that I can remember, but it seems reasonable that Belle Starr is in this time in her life likely could have frequented the Kendrick house.
Oh, definitely. I think it's, that's definitely possible. A lot of the people who played a role in the war in this area, I'm sure, did. They, and I'm sure that her family and the Kindreds knew each other. And actually, even before the war, her family knew the Youngers and the Jameses, even though they were from the Kansas City area. So there were connections there. I mean, again, it's funny, these personalities interacted more than you think, but it's certainly possible, and as well as other people. So it would be hard pressed that they wouldn't know each other, considering um, the amount of property and their business interests, I would think.
Right. Right. Was there, at the end of the war,
Mhm.
was there anything left of downtown Carthage?
Very little, very little. There were about three houses that survived the war that were there before the war. Pretty much everything had been burned or destroyed in one way or another, or abandoned. Um, there are accounts that just, two or three houses, buildings were occupied in town. There's accounts at the end of the war that basically everything had gone feral. You had, uh, the streets were grown up. They talked about wolves walking the streets. Um, there were accounts that basically you had skirmishes occur quite a few actually, and no one was around to bury them.
Yeah.
There's an account from late 1864 of soldiers coming in from Fort Scott, Union soldiers, and either side that would come in, they would still stay on the square, and because you had part of the courthouse ruins still there, and they would use it as a lookout point. And there's a diary of a soldier saying that they could smell death for miles before they got there. And when they got there, they camped on the courthouse yard. And after supper, they're standing and sitting around talking. And he said he looked up, and one of the guys was standing there, and the heel of his boot was in the open end of a human jaw, like a stirrup. Because you know the skeleton was just laying on the ground.
Hmm.
So I mean, that's how desperate things got.
Yes, and I'm assuming that a lot of these deaths and this devastation that took place uh, occurred after the Battle of Carthage, after the official
Oh,
battle,
oh yeah,
over the next
definitely
4 years.
over time. But yeah, it just basically kind of got worse over time. In 1863, the town was burned. And at that point, there were accounts that the smoke clouds over the town were just enveloped the whole area of the town, and that some accounts were that they ended up almost in a swirling action, a huge cloud circling, like described it as wagons circling.
Mm, wow, it's I think it stands to reason that the civilian population of the United States in these broad swaths that were impacted by the war could not have imagined what was coming.
No, I don't think so. Particularly in the early days, and around the time of the Battle of Carthage and so forth. Um, on the one hand, events from Bleeding Kansas have been going on for several years, so there had been some tension and wariness, of the border just to the west. But I doubt that people were really anticipating the intensity, the widespreadness of violence as soon as it happened out here.
Mhm.
I just doubt it.
Yeah, yeah. It's of course in the where I grew up in Illinois and in Iowa. These were certainly, especially in Illinois, uh, Lincoln country first and
Mhm.
foremost, and also very certainly for the civilian populations there, they would have been sending their sons.
Yeah. And
Uh,
there were actually a lot of volunteers fighting in Missouri from Iowa, particularly.
but the war itself would have been very distant.
Yes. Well, in fact, the armory at St. Louis, General Lyon, basically moved everything from the armory to Alton,
Yes. Do we know
Illinois.
where they
I
set up?
I don't know exactly, but basically, and I read something the other day about just the sheer numbers of weapons and munitions that were moved, and it was astronomical.
Yes.
But they knew as long as they got it across the Mississippi, it was safe.
Hmm. Which is kind of incredible, really.
Hmm.
And from by even today's driving standards, the Peoria County and Chillicothe, where I grew up, um, is a good 3 hours north
Yeah.
from Alton in the middle of the state. For individuals, unless their sons were fighting, they would have vicariously experienced the war purely through newspaper.
Yeah, through newspaper, word of mouth, that kind of thing. Yeah.
hmm And then, of course, here it's happening in individuals' backyards.
Yes, and on their porch step
Yeah,
sometimes.
and sometimes through their house.
Yes. Yeah, literally.
It's hard. I mean, there's hard lessons in that.
Mhm.
I also find it particularly interesting that the while the casualty count of the Battle of Carthage, July 5th, 1861, was really quite comparatively low. Of course, the continued violence uh, in Carthage, and you can also assume surrounding Carthage,
Mhm.
being so high over the next several years, that many hauntings would not necessarily be associated with the battle itself, but certainly would have been directly associated with the war.
Yes, that's very fair. I mean, yeah, there may be some hauntings related to the battle, but there's certainly hauntings related to other events. And just perspective, President Lincoln said that his greatest fear of during the war was what was happening in Southwest Missouri would spread to the rest of the country,
Yes.
um, because the guerrilla warfare and the scorched earth policy was so devastating that if the rest of the country turned to guerrilla warfare like that, they estimated it'd be at least another 20 years to end the war.
Mhm. Which is
So
incredible. Yeah.
that gives you an idea of how violent and devastating things here were if what was happening here would have had that effect.
Yes. Yes. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned. I mean, a lot of lessons to be gleaned.
Mm.
Um, and I think certainly the first lesson that comes to my mind is treating the past with respect,
Mhm.
and treating the past, judging the past not by our own contemporary sensibilities, but judging the past within the context of its own time.
Yes. No, I definitely agree. I don't know whether you want to hit any of the other personalities or not.
Oh, we could start a firestorm and talk about Nathaniel Lyon. Fiery abolitionist from Connecticut,
Yes.
uh, who spent some unplanned time in a cellar in Springfield.
Yes, very unplanned, and I'm sure Miss Phelps was a little disconcerted as well, although she obliged. But yes, General Lyon became the first Union general to be killed in war at Wilson's Creek. Actually, earning the respect of the Confederates around him in his dying moments for the veracity of his uh, fight, with some of them saying that they had never seen a man fight as hard as he did.
Yes.
Um, and then after the battle, the Confederates controlled the area, and so now he was behind enemy lines. And so uh, John Phelps' wife, who they had a large farm in what is now Springfield, um, had his body taken to the farmhouse, and they dug a grave in her root cellar, and um, he was buried there for, I think, 2 years until they were able to take him back to Connecticut.
Yes. What do you there's obviously, coming back to the infamous meeting between
Mhm.
Claiborne Fox Jackson and Nathaniel Lyon in the May of 1861,
Mhm.
I believe, at the Planter House
Mhm.
in St. Louis. Some very vehement words were spoken
Yes.
between these men.
Yeah. Both directions.
Yes.
No love
And
lost.
um, what do you make of General Lyon's sensibility and raison d'etre in terms of the war?
Well, his background, he was a very seasoned officer and was already a veteran of Indian wars for the West when he got stationed in St. Louis. So he was accustomed to action. He was accustomed to fighting.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think that the controversy comes along with what exactly did he mean by his words when he and Jackson were arguing about whether basically who who should be able to control um, raising regiments in Missouri, and whether or not Jackson was obligated to provide men as requested by President Lincoln. And there's two versions of the story. One version is that Lyon basically said, I'd rather see you, and myself 6 feet under the sod before I concede an inch of authority to you from the government, federal government. The other version is that he included beyond that every woman, man, woman, and child in Missouri in that statement. That seems a little rash. Um, it doesn't seem to make sense for him to have said that. You're looking at a situation that you're basically you're arguing about who has authority here, and it just seems to me to setting aside partisanship, it just doesn't make any sense to me saying I'd rather see everyone in the state dead. That's not a statement that usually comes from someone with that kind of background that's been successful and not been so rash that he hasn't been killed in an Indian war. So
And, and of course, we have, as you've already noted, we do have him essentially, not even essentially, according to Confederate accounts, dying with honor at the Battle
yeah.
of Wilson's Creek.
Yes, and expressing respect for his valor, and bravery. So it's easy to toss words around in retrospect, but and certainly the governor's contingent in the room may have felt that they would benefit from an embellishment. We'll never know for sure, but it just doesn't seem to make sense to me, and no other actions were taken that would have made that would indicate that he had those kind of thoughts or ideas. There's no rounding up of civilians and that kind of thing or anything.
Mhm. Now, we're not going to go really deep, but I think a great place to perhaps conclude is with a war hero that I think you and I both share a deep respect and fondness for,
Yes.
who wasn't an unknown name in regional Missouri based on some interesting exploits,
Hmm.
uh, with possibly some questionable ethics attached to that in his younger years,
Yes.
but certainly not mm, you know, uh, a household name by any stretch of the imagination of the era.
No.
Um, on horseback, north of Carthage, leading the Confederate cavalry of the Missouri State Partisans, and that's Joe Shelby.
Yes. And at that point, he was a volunteer. had raised a regiment from his county up at Lexington. And yes, was a volunteer captain, and answered the call for volunteers from Governor Jackson. Yeah, Shelby's kind of interesting because he was 30 at the time. So when you look back, that he had been involved in events in Bleeding, Kansas for beginning 6 years before. So he was a relatively young man when that was going on. You're looking 23, 24, 25, somewhere in there. And was basically over there opposing abolitionists, even though he's from Missouri. There's various accounts of exactly what all he did and so on and so forth. That as far as I've ever been able to tell, he admitted that, yes, he was over there in his later years, recanted that he should not have been over there, that he had no business being over there, in retrospect. But as a consequence, and he believed, and a lot of people believed, that as a consequence of those actions, his business, a sawmill and I think there was a store associated with it, were burned to the ground in Lexington. And so he and his business partner basically lost everything. And his partner, who was his brother-in-law, moved to Kentucky. So here he is, mid-20s, $9,000 in debt in 1855, which is an astronomical amount of money at that time. And certainly then trying to rebuild his life, answered the call. But as a military man at that point, he was unknown and untrained. And ironically, his brigade was the first to engage Sigel's men.
Yes. First engagement in the first land battle.
Mm-hmm.
It's incredible.
And if anyone that isn't familiar with Joe Shelby, ultimately was the only general who never surrendered.
Yes. It became renowned, we won't go into detail, but became renowned through the war. Yes,
and considered absolutely one of the best cavalry commanders of the war. And to be honest, if he'd been operating in the Eastern Theater, it'd probably been a lot better remembered now.
Yes. And he was at Carthage.
He was at Carthage.
Bell Star was at Carthage. Franz Sigel
Bill Hickok was at Carthage as well.
What was he doing there? What was his role?
He was a scout for the Union Army. So actually, he was one of the scouts that, scouted where Jackson's men were.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's an interesting note. Now we're just talking shop, but there's an interesting note that I believe that Jackson was actually in town the day before.
Yes.
How did that work?
He'd been had gone into town. Who knows? Who, maybe meeting somebody or what, or just gauging support or feelings of the residents.
Wow, that's the just the interwoven movement of people across quote unquote battle lines, etc., or interactions with him is just fascinating to me in regards to Civil War history.
It really is to me too, and perhaps that's a good place to end it.
I think so. We'll have cool stuff coming up next week. Remember the Ball House on June 11th. Check out the Facebook page for getting that set up so that you can attend. Space is limited. Like, share, subscribe, so on and so forth. If you're watching us on YouTube, please click the notification bell.
Yes. And thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you all. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Josh.